Something extraordinary happened this morning, and most people still haven't grasped what it really means. At roughly 11 a.m. Eastern Time, the President of the United States issued a threat that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Not a partial tariff, not a targeted sanction, a full 100% tariff on every Canadian good entering the United States. Every product, every shipment, every industry. Overnight, prices would effectively double, and the official reason given was simple on the surface. Canada made a deal with China. At first glance, this sounds like just another chapter in the endless tariff wars, another headline, another trade dispute. But this isn't really about tariffs, and it's not even primarily about China. What we're watching unfold is a deep shift in power dynamics inside North America itself, a shift that has been building quietly for years and is now spilling into the open. To understand why this moment matters, we need to go back just 1 week. Canada's Prime Minister steps off a plane in Beijing, marking the first visit by a Canadian leader to China in nearly a decade. Relations between the two countries had been frozen for years, locked in retaliatory trade barriers and diplomatic standoffs. That trip alone was a signal, but what followed made it unmistakable. After hours of closed-door talks, Canada and China announced a deal that reset their economic relationship. A limited number of Chinese electric vehicles would be allowed into the Canadian market at reduced tariffs. In exchange, China would slash massive penalties on Canadian agricultural exports and remove tariffs entirely on key seafood products. For farmers and exporters who had watched their markets vanish overnight years earlier, this was nothing short of a lifeline. Inside Canada, the reaction was immediate and divided. Agricultural regions welcomed the move with open arms. Coastal industries celebrated restored access to one of the world's largest markets. But in industrial centers tied closely to the U.S. economy, alarm bells rang. Not because of China itself, but because of what this decision would mean in Washington. Those concerns proved justified almost instantly. Within days, rhetoric escalated. Public remarks turned sharp. Social media posts followed. And then came the threat. A blunt, unmistakable warning that if Canada moved forward with this agreement, it would face economic punishment on a scale never before directed at a close ally. Most coverage has framed this as a personal dispute, a clash of egos, a reaction to speeches and symbolism. And while personal dynamics absolutely play a role, that explanation misses the deeper reality. This threat isn't about pride. It's about control. It's about the future of the North American trade system itself. There is a critical deadline approaching that changes everything. In exactly 6 months, the trade agreement governing economic relations between the United States, Canada, and Mexico faces mandatory review. This review isn't optional. It was built into the agreement from the start. And what happens at that table will determine whether the partnership continues smoothly, becomes unstable, or begins a slow march toward collapse. For years, this review was expected to be procedural, minor updates, technical adjustments. But that assumption vanished the moment political leadership in Washington changed. Suddenly, the review became leverage, a pressure point, a moment where one country could attempt to reshape the entire system in its own image. From the American perspective, the concern is framed as security and fairness. Officials argue that China is finding indirect pathways into the U.S. market by investing in factories north and south of the border. They claim that components and capital flow through Canada and Mexico, allowing products with deep Chinese supply chains to reach American consumers under preferential rules. Whether this is happening at scale is debated. Supply chains are complex, and proving intent is difficult. But perception matters more than proof, and in this case, perception has hardened into policy. Canada's China deal was interpreted not as diversification, but as defiance, as a signal that Ottawa was no longer willing to align its economic strategy exclusively with Washington's priorities. And in a system built on dependency, independence looks like a threat. This is where the story shifts from trade policy to something far more consequential. Because Canada isn't turning toward China out of enthusiasm. It's doing so out of necessity. When your largest trading partner demonstrates unpredictability, uses economic pressure as a political tool, and openly questions your sovereignty, you don't double down, you hedge. That hedging is what triggered this crisis. Not the number of vehicles, not the tariff percentage, but the message behind the move. Canada was signaling that it has options. And for the first time in decades, that signal is being taken seriously. What happens next will define more than one relationship. It will determine whether North America remains an integrated economic bloc or fractures into competing interests, and the clock is already ticking. To understand why this moment feels so volatile, you have to look at how deeply intertwined the North American economy has become over the last 3 decades. This isn't simple import and export. It's a single production system spread across borders. Raw materials cross multiple times. Components are designed collaboratively. Manufacturing decisions are based on the assumption that borders remain predictable. That assumption is now under strain. The threat of 100% tariffs doesn't just target Canada. It reverberates through American industries almost immediately. Entire sectors rely on Canadian inputs, from energy and metals to auto parts and electricity. Disrupting those flows doesn't create resilience, it creates shock. Supporters of aggressive tariff strategies often argue that domestic production will simply replace imports. In theory, that sounds plausible. In reality, it ignores timelines and costs. You cannot rebuild decades of supply infrastructure overnight. New factories take years. New suppliers require investment. And companies don't invest when policy shifts are unpredictable. This is where political pressure begins to clash with economic reality. Businesses plan in decades. Political cycles move in months. When those timelines collide, uncertainty wins. Inside Canada, leadership understands this risk, but it also understands something else. Dependence is a vulnerability. When 70+% of your exports flow to a single market, any disruption becomes existential. Diversification isn't ideological, it's survival. That is why the China deal matters symbolically. It demonstrates that Canada is willing to endure short-term tension to reduce long-term exposure. And that calculation changes the negotiation dynamics entirely. From Washington's perspective, this looks like erosion of leverage. The entire logic of pressure tactics depends on asymmetry. If the other side has nowhere else to go, threats work. The moment alternatives exist, threats lose potency. This is why the upcoming trade review looms so large. The United States wants stricter rules, tighter definitions, explicit alignment against Chinese economic influence. Canada and Mexico want predictability and autonomy. They want the benefits of integration without political submission. These positions are not easily reconciled. Legally, the tools available to impose tariffs remain broad. Court challenges have created confusion, but executive authority remains strong enough to act quickly. That means threats are not empty, they carry weight. And that weight is already being felt in boardrooms, investment decisions, and currency markets. Yet power cuts both ways. A tariff war of this scale would impose real costs on American households. Prices would rise, industries would slow, political pressure would build domestically as voters feel the impact. This is the counterweight Canada is quietly counting on. The question becomes one of endurance. Who can tolerate pain longer? Who bends first? And whether compromise remains possible before damage becomes irreversible. What complicates this further is the signal being sent to the rest of the world. Allies are watching closely. If a country as integrated and aligned as Canada can be threatened so openly, others begin recalculating their own dependencies. This is how trust erodes, not in dramatic collapse, but in incremental decisions. New trade routes, alternative partnerships, redundant systems. Each move small on its own, but transformative in aggregate. The post-war economic order was built on predictability, on the assumption that agreements would outlast leaders, that trade would be governed by rules rather than leverage. When that assumption breaks, everything becomes negotiable again. That is the real risk here. Not a single tariff, not a single deal, but the normalization of economic coercion between partners who once relied on stability as their greatest shared asset. And with 6 months remaining until the review, every move from this point forward is positioning. Every speech, every deal, every threat is part of a broader contest over the future structure of North American power. As this standoff intensifies, the stakes continue to rise quietly beneath the headlines. Markets dislike uncertainty, and this situation is saturated with it. Businesses don't know which rules will apply next year. Investors don't know where to allocate capital. Supply chains pause, waiting for clarity that may not arrive in time. This is where the confrontation moves beyond policy and into psychology. Leadership styles matter. Decisions made under pressure harden quickly into identity. Backing down becomes reputationally costly. Compromise starts to look like weakness. For Canada, the calculation is stark. Accepting external control over trade relationships would lock the country into permanent vulnerability. Standing firm risks economic retaliation. Neither option is painless, but only one preserves sovereignty. For the United States, the calculation is equally complex. Demonstrating strength may consolidate political support in the short term, but sustained economic disruption carries electoral consequences. Pressure that works once may fail when repeated too often. Meanwhile, the integrated nature of the North American economy means that damage rarely stays contained. When factories slow in one country, they slow in all three. When costs rise, they ripple outward. When uncertainty grows, innovation stalls. This is why many analysts believe the ultimate outcome will not be a clean victory for either side, but a negotiated recalibration. The question is how much damage occurs before compromise becomes inevitable. The deeper issue, however, is already unfolding regardless of the immediate outcome. The assumption that North America would move inexorably toward deeper integration has been broken. From now on, diversification will accelerate. Redundancy will replace efficiency. Strategic autonomy will outweigh pure cost savings. That shift has long-term consequences. It makes systems more resilient, but also more expensive. It reduces vulnerability, but increases friction. It marks the transition from an era of globalization to one of managed fragmentation. And this trade dispute, though framed narrowly, is one of the clearest signals of that transition. 6 months from now, the formal review will begin. By then, positions will be entrenched, public narratives will be set, domestic audiences will expect firmness. That leaves little room for dramatic reversals. What happens in that room will shape the trajectory of North American cooperation for a generation. It will determine whether shared institutions can adapt to political volatility or whether they slowly erode under it. This is not a story about tariffs alone. It's about whether rules built for stability can survive leadership that views flexibility as weakness. It's about whether alliances remain partnerships or become leverage points. And it's about whether economic integration, once seen as irreversible, can be undone by political will. The answer is not yet clear, but the direction is unmistakable. The era of unquestioned trust is over. What replaces it will depend on choices made in the coming months, choices driven not just by economics, but by identity, power, and the willingness to accept limits. That is why this moment matters, not because of a single threat, but because of what it reveals about the world we are entering.